There are lots and lots of plant things or natural dyes that you can order online, like fustic, which is sawdust from a tree that grows in like Florida and Central America and South America, but doesn't grow up here. So you're not going to go out and cut down a fustic tree up here. It actually, if you might look at it again, I'll tell you the real name of the tree. But so I buy that online. I go to somebody and buy that online. You can also buy seeds for many of these plants that you're not going to find at Home Depot or Lowe's or even Tractor Supply. So, for example, you can buy calendula, which is also known as pot marigold. Now that's a very hardy annual. You can sow it indoors in the spring, transplant it out after danger of frost has passed. But the flower heads are about this big. And you want to take just the flower head just at its peak of color. Some things you can wait for them to fade, like a daylily. You can go out the next day and pick off the daylily pods and you'll get the color because they only bloom for a day. But some things, if you let them dry, you're going to get a lower saturation color. You're not going to get the nice clear colors. So calendula, coreopsis, there's two kinds of coreopsis. There's one called Dyers coreopsis, and then there's another one that's called just plain coreopsis. And the plain coreopsis can either be an annual or a perennial. And it's one that propagates by dividing. And I talk a little bit about how you propagate the plants, whether you plant them from seed, whether you bend their branches under the ground and stake them down for a year so they develop roots and then you've got a new plant, whether you do them from cuttings, that kind of thing.
I've got a bunch of the Dyers coreopsis going. I think somebody here gave me seed. But the flowers small, you're right.
They're very small.
And last year I grew them too, and I never got enough to do anything at any one time. They just kind of bloom continuously, sporadically all summer. And I have a 4x4 raised bed full of them.
And what to make them to get more blooms on them, you actually would cut them back to one of the branchings so that you get a much bushier plant and pick them at their peak of color. Now,
probably I should start them inside too.
You can start them inside, yeah. Now Sharon said that some of the things, I think it was you said you'd put them in the freezer and they didn't work as well, or maybe that, no, somebody said.
I found drying works better than freezer, but it's not as good as fresh.
But the Dyers coreopsis, if you just put them in a bowl of water when you bring them in and keep them hydrated, you can save them for a week or two, and you'll start leaching the color even if it's in cool water before you actually cook them up. Most of these things say, like the Dyers coreopsis and the coreopsis and the calendula and the marigold, don't include that the I think it's called the petiole, the green calyx. Don't include the green part of the flower, because what it does is then that makes it takes away from your pure clear yellow. Sometimes it actually makes them tan.
You know, the bottom part of all the flowers has a green thing holding everything together. That's what she's talking about.
Okay. So you want to take all that green stuff off and just keep the colored portions of the plant. Now some things like Asiatic lilies, you can actually include the pollen in with your mix because that pollen is a very rich yellowy orange. You would put your, what I'm calling plant stuff or dye stuff, in water. You can pour boiling water over it, or you can put it in cool water and let the temperature come up. What I've found, and maybe this works for you too, Sherry, is if I bring it up just to a simmer and let it simmer for an hour, that does much better than boiling it. So if you get the temperature up between 180 and 200, you're not going to scorch your colors. Your colors are going to stay clearer for you. And some of the books say, okay, you got your flowers in there, just throw your dye stuff in. Well, I never do that. I take another pan, I put a white t-shirt over the pan and put an elastic around that, and then I pour my dye bath through that, and that gets the big stuff and the small stuff out, and then I can reuse that. You can get another batch of dye out of the same plant stuff by just rehydrating it and doing it again for another hour. And that t-shirt rinses out. You just turn it over and you do several dunks in another dye bath, and you get all that the small stuff and the big stuff off, and you can do another bath. Typically, progressive baths are going to be weaker in color, so you're going to get your strongest color from your first one, and then you're going to get your next color in your next color. The other thing that is recommended if you want intense colors is that when you put your dye stuff in, you either heat it up or let it stay at heat for at least 30 minutes. Some of these will say 30, some will say 45, some will say 60. Then let the dye stuff cool in the water overnight. And that's when you're going to get your strongest colors. Some of these say mordant, some of them you don't mordant, and I've talked about particularly alum and chromium and iron as mordants. So if you're going to pre-mordant, you're going to take your wool. I do wool and silk, I don't dye much cotton. And you put it in a dye bath that has your mordant in it. You let it stay at least an hour. And then you take that out and you rinse it. It's not going to rinse the mordant out of the fiber, but it's going to rinse the mordant off of the surface of the fiber, because if you don't do that, the dye stuff is going to adhere to the mordant particulates in the dye bath before it strikes on the yarn. It's just that's the most available, so it's going to go with what the most available is. So if you mordant it, you can mordant it for an hour or overnight. Take it out, squeeze it out, dip it to rinse the surface off, and then put it in your dye bath. You're going to get better dye adherence to the fiber as opposed to adherence to the mordant. Some of the mordants, that one skein that Sherry was showing us, some of these will say pre-mordant in alum, dye it, take it out of the dye pot hot, put it in a hot dye bath that has like citric acid in it. And so you're going to change the acidity of it in the second dye bath, and it'll give you a different color. But only leave it in there for 10 minutes.
I like to put the yellows after I'm done dyeing them. I like to put some in iron and get like sage green.
Sage greens,
So you get
beautiful
two
greens,
colors.
yeah. And some of these things we'll talk about. If you use the stems and the leaves, you'll get this color. You can use the whole plant. Some plants, when you're, like in the fall, when your coreopsis plants are pretty much dead, just go and clip them off at the base, throw the whole thing, flowers, stems, roots, leaves, everything in except for the root, into your dye bath. And you're going to get a sagier green or a yellowier green with that.
Not as pure of a yellow, but more of
Right.
a green. Okay.
Right.
That's good.
Cosmos are another flowers that a lot of people have just growing in their garden, and they make beautiful dyes. You can start the seeds inside and set them out after the danger of frost. Now, if you put them in a soil that's too rich, they're going to grow beautiful leaves, and they're going to flower late. So for Cosmos, you want that soil to not be quite as rich. So you don't want as much organic material in your soil. So, and a lot of those things are discussed under individual plants in this handout. Goldenrod, which when I was growing up, goldenrod was a weed. Nobody wanted it. Goldenrod now is something that's cultivated in gardens. It's selected particularly for its beautiful plume. Now, some of these things can be pretty invasive, so be a good citizen and make sure that you're not letting them out of your flower gardens. And the goldenrod, you want to pick just as those little tiny flowers start to open. And that's going to give you your best color. But again, the goldenrod, you can use stem, leaves, and flower for slightly different colors. One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting is heather is a perennial plant that's grown in the Highlands of Scotland. And a lot of the tartans have the greens and the purples that the heather plant is able to produce for you. But as you can imagine, they're going to want a soil that's a lot more peat. So they're going to want a much more acidic soil because that's the bugs. We have hollyhocks, which are a beautiful old-fashioned plant, and hollyhocks make a gorgeous. Now I want to talk a little bit about indigo and a little bit about, part of my biological background is Welsh, so I like to think of myself as one of the blue painted, using woad, blue painted.
The warriors, the rebels, the braveheart ones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the royal blue. Yeah.
Yeah, some guy told me that was like a real medieval. I
Oh,
did
yeah.
a presentation at Phipps on dyes, and he said it's a hallucinogen. So
Makes
that's
you
partly how
berserker.
they got so
That
pumped up
explains
and
a
crazy.
lot.
Yeah, brave and happy.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, there's a workshop for us.
Hands along.
Hallucinogenic dyes.
Well, think about a common daffodil. We all have daffodils. Yellow trumpet daffodils make beautiful yellow dye, but the daffodil liqueur, the stem juice, is actually poisonous. And if you are doing a lot with daffodils, you should be wearing